The chapel smelled of dust and dying roses. Garrett Hayes stood at the altar, his calloused fingers pulling at the frayed cuffs of a suit he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral. Afternoon light slanted through cracked stained glass, casting broken colors across the empty pews. Only 3 witnesses sat scattered in the shadows. None of them smiled. At the far end of the aisle, a figure in white emerged. She moved slowly, deliberately, a porcelain mask concealing half her face. The visible half revealed nothing. No warmth, no fear. Just skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones and one gray eye that never blinked. Garrett's throat tightened. He didn't know her name until 3 days ago. He had never heard her voice. But somewhere across town, his 7-year-old son lay in a hospital bed, his failing heart carrying a price tag of $200,000. And this stranger had offered to pay it all. One condition: 1 year of marriage. Her heels clicked against stone, each step a hammer blow. When she stopped before him, he caught the faint trace of something floral beneath the sharper scent of antiseptic. Clinical. Cold. Like marrying a ghost. The priest cleared his throat and opened his Bible. Garrett drew a breath that tasted like surrender. He was about to sell the only thing he had left. But what waited behind that mask would prove far more terrifying than any scar he had imagined. 3 weeks earlier, Garrett had sat in a plastic chair outside the cardiology unit, staring at a crack in the linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. His hands, still covered in sawdust from the cabinet he'd been building that morning, hung limp between his knees. A doctor in blue scrubs had just told him that his son needed surgery within 60 days, or his heart would give out completely. $200,000. The number echoed in Garrett's skull like a gunshot in an empty room. He had $47 in his checking account, and a truck that wouldn't pass inspection. The doctor's lips kept moving, something about payment plans and financial assistance. But all Garrett could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, counting down the days his son had left. He had tried everything. The bank turned him away before he finished his first sentence. His brother, who hadn't spoken to him since their mother's funeral, let the call go to voicemail 3 times before blocking his number. Garrett even swallowed his pride and called his late wife's parents, the same people who blamed him for their daughter dying in childbirth. Her mother listened in silence for 30 seconds before hanging up. That night, Garrett sat on the edge of Colton's hospital bed and watched his son sleep. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythms. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look like a faded photograph. Colton was 7 years old. He liked dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches with the crusts cut off. He believed his father could fix anything, and Garrett was about to let him die. The lawyer appeared 3 days later. Garrett was loading his tools into his truck outside the hospital when a black sedan pulled into the space beside him. The man who stepped out wore a suit that cost more than Garrett's entire wardrobe. He introduced himself as Peter Callahan, attorney at law, and handed Garrett a business card printed on paper, so thick it felt like cloth. His client, he explained, had a proposition. A woman of considerable means wished to enter into a contractual marriage for a period of 1 year. In exchange, she would cover all medical expenses for Garrett's son, plus provide a monthly stipend for living costs. Garrett laughed in his face. Then Peter Callahan opened a leather briefcase and showed him a cashier's check for $200,000, already made out to the hospital. The laughter died in Garrett's throat. There were conditions, of course. Garrett would live in his wife's residence for the duration of the marriage. He would attend certain social functions as her spouse. He would not ask questions about her past, her business, or the mask she wore at all times. Physical intimacy was neither required nor expected. At the end of 12 months, they would divorce quietly, and Garrett would be free to return to his life with his healthy son. No strings attached. Garrett asked why. Why him? Why this arrangement? Peter Callahan smiled the way lawyers do when they're about to lie, and said his client had her reasons. That was all he was authorized to disclose. Garrett had 48 hours to decide. He spent the first 24 sitting beside Colton's bed, watching monitors beep and lines spike. He spent the next 23 arguing with himself, listing every reason this was insane. Then he watched a nurse adjust Colton's oxygen mask, and he picked up the phone. The wedding ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Garrett spoke his vows to a woman whose full name he'd learned only that morning. Rosalie Whitmore, 29 years old. No other details provided. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, she did not lift her veil for a kiss. She simply extended one gloved hand, and Garrett shook it like they were closing a business deal, which, he supposed, they were. A car waited outside to take them to her home. Garrett climbed into the back seat beside his new wife and watched the hospital disappear through the tinted window. Somewhere inside those walls, his son was already being prepped for surgery. The check had cleared that morning. Whatever else this marriage was, it had already saved Colton's life. Garrett turned to thank the woman beside him, but she was staring straight ahead, her gloved hands folded in her lap, as still as a statue carved from ice. The house was not what Garrett expected. He had imagined something cold and modern, all glass and sharp angles. Instead, the car pulled up to a Victorian manor on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and ancient oak trees. Paint peeled from the shutters. Ivy crawled up the eastern wall like green veins. The place looked like it had been beautiful once, before someone stopped caring. Rosalie led him inside without a word. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and old wood. Photographs lined the walls, but every face had been removed, cut out with surgical precision, leaving only bodies and backgrounds. Garrett paused before one image, a woman in a garden holding a small child, both their faces missing. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the draft seeping through the windows. His room was on the second floor, at the opposite end of the hall from hers. Clean sheets, empty dresser, a window overlooking the neglected rose garden below. Rosalie stood in the doorway and explained the rules. Meals would be served at 7, 12, and 6. The West Wing was off limits. She worked from home and was not to be disturbed during business hours. If he needed anything, he could speak to Mrs. Freely, the housekeeper. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the corridor like the last notes of a song he couldn't quite remember. Garrett sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. He had just married a woman he couldn't look at, moved into a house full of faceless photographs, and sold a year of his life for a check. Somewhere, his late wife was probably laughing at him, or crying. He couldn't decide which. The first month passed in a blur of hospital visits and awkward silences. Colton's surgery was a success. Garrett stood outside the operating room for 9 hours, pacing a groove into the floor until a surgeon emerged and told him his son would live. He wept in a bathroom stall for 20 minutes, then washed his face and called Rosalie to deliver the news. She answered on the first ring, listened without interrupting, and said she was glad. That was all. 2 words. Then she hung up. Garrett stared at the phone in his hand and wondered if he had imagined the slight tremor in her voice. He decided he had. Women like her didn't tremble. Women like her didn't feel anything at all. Colton came home to the manor 6 weeks after the wedding. Garrett had been worried about how to explain the situation, but children possess a remarkable ability to accept the impossible as ordinary. Colton explored every room he was allowed to enter, befriended Mrs. Freely within an hour, and declared his new bedroom the greatest place he had ever seen. When he finally met Rosalie, he stared at her mask for a long moment, then asked if she was a superhero in disguise. Rosalie stood frozen in the hallway, her visible eye wide with something Garrett couldn't name. Then, slowly, she knelt down to Colton's level and said that, no, she wasn't a superhero. She was just someone who'd had an accident. Colton nodded solemnly and asked if it hurt. Rosalie was quiet for so long that Garrett almost intervened. Then she said yes. Sometimes it still did. Colton reached out and patted her gloved hand. "That's okay," he said. "My daddy fixes things that are broken. Maybe he can fix you too." That night, after Colton had gone to bed, Garrett found Rosalie sitting alone in the library, surrounded by darkness. He didn't turn on the light. He just sat down in the chair across from her and waited. After a long silence, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, raw in a way he hadn't heard before. "Children are supposed to be afraid of things that look different," she said. "They're supposed to stare and point and ask cruel questions without knowing they're being cruel." But he just asked if it hurt. Like I was a person. Like I was real. Garrett didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing you could offer someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like. The next morning, Rosalie appeared at breakfast for the first time since Garrett and Colton had moved in. She sat at the head of the table, her mask firmly in place, and asked Colton what he wanted to do that day. The boy launched into an elaborate plan involving dinosaur hunting in the garden and maybe building a fort if his dad had time. Rosalie listened to every word like he was reciting poetry. When Colton asked if she wanted to help with the fort, her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. She said yes. She said yes like the word was a door she had been afraid to open for a very long time. Something shifted after that. Rosalie began appearing at dinner more often. She would sit across from Garrett and Colton, listening as the boy chattered about dinosaurs and cartoons and the cardinal he'd seen in the garden that morning. She rarely spoke, but her eye followed Colton with an intensity that bordered on hunger. When the boy laughed, her hand would twitch toward him, then retreat. When he struggled to cut his meat, she would quietly slide a knife beneath his plate, positioning it for easier use, so subtly that Garrett almost missed it. She was watching his son the way a ghost watches the living, with longing and loss, and something that looked almost like grief. 3 months in, Garrett woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He found Rosalie standing outside Colton's room, her hand pressed flat against the door, her forehead resting against the wood. She didn't seem to notice him. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. And in the pale moonlight streaming through the window, Garrett could see her shoulders shaking. He cleared his throat softly, and she spun around, her single visible eye wild with panic. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Rosalie whispered that she was sorry. She hadn't meant to disturb anyone. She just wanted to make sure the boy was breathing. Garrett asked why she cared so much. She looked at him the way a drowning person looks at the shore, desperate and defeated all at once. "Because," she said, "someone has to." Then she walked away, and Garrett stood alone in the dark hallway, listening to Colton's steady breathing through the door, wondering what kind of woman checks on a child who isn't hers in the middle of the night. He started paying attention after that. The way she remembered that Colton liked his orange juice without pulp. The way she left children's books on the table where he'd find them, always about brave knights and kind dragons, never anything scary. The way she flinched whenever anyone mentioned fire. Garrett noticed the heating system in the manor was electric. No fireplace, no gas stove, nothing that produced an open flame. He noticed that Mrs. Freely changed all the candles in the house to battery-operated ones after Rosalie moved in. He noticed that his son had started drawing pictures for her, leaving them outside her office door like offerings to a distant goddess. And he noticed that every single one disappeared by morning. The dinner conversation changed somewhere around month 4. Rosalie asked about his work, and Garrett found himself talking about carpentry, about the satisfaction of taking raw wood and turning it into something useful. She listened with her chin resting on her gloved hand, asking questions that proved she actually understood what he was saying. He learned that she ran a foundation, something to do with children's hospitals and burn units, though she deflected whenever he pressed for details. He learned that she had studied architecture before her accident, that she dreamed of designing buildings that felt like home. He learned that her favorite color was the blue of the sky right before dawn, and that she hadn't seen a sunrise in 3 years because she couldn't bear to look at anything that reminded her of light. Garrett started building things for the house, a new bookshelf for the library, a rocking chair for the garden, a small wooden box for Colton to keep his treasures in. Rosalie never thanked him directly, but he would find small gifts outside his door in return. A new set of chisels one morning, a first-edition book on woodworking another. They were dancing around each other, two broken people trying to communicate in a language neither of them fully understood. One night, after Colton had fallen asleep and Mrs. Freely had retired for the evening, Garrett found Rosalie sitting alone in the dark parlor, staring at nothing. He sat down across from her without asking permission. They stayed like that for an hour, not speaking, just existing in the same space, and somehow, that felt like more intimacy than Garrett had experienced in years. The foundation of their strange domesticity was built on small moments. Garrett would come downstairs in the morning and find a fresh pot of coffee already made, the mug he preferred set out beside it. He never saw Rosalie make it. She seemed to know his schedule better than he did, appearing and disappearing like a ghost who had memorized the rhythms of his life. One afternoon, he caught a glimpse of her through the kitchen window, standing in the garden with her face tilted toward the sun. Her mask was still in place, but her posture was different than usual. Softer, almost peaceful. When she noticed him watching, she straightened immediately, the wall snapping back into place. But for just a moment, he had seen something vulnerable beneath the armor, something human, something achingly alone. Mrs. Freely told him stories when Rosalie wasn't around, about the woman she had been before the accident. Brilliant and ambitious, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune she'd never wanted, determined to use her family's money to help children who reminded her of her own difficult childhood. She had been engaged once, Mrs. Freely said, her voice dropping to a whisper. A handsome man from a good family. He left 3 days after he saw what the fire had done to her face, packed his bags while she was still in the burn unit, and sent his apologies through a lawyer. Rosalie never spoke his name again. She stopped going outside. She stopped seeing friends. She stopped believing that anyone could ever look at her without flinching. And then one day, she saw a photograph of a little boy with a failing heart, and a father who couldn't afford to save him, and something in her woke up. Month 5 brought a charity gala. Rosalie's foundation was honoring its donors, and as her husband, Garrett was expected to attend. He rented a tuxedo that fit poorly and stood at her side, while strangers in expensive clothes whispered behind their hands. The masked woman and her carpenter husband. What a peculiar arrangement. Rosalie navigated the room like a general surveying a battlefield, her spine straight, her chin high, her visible eye cold enough to freeze anyone who stared too long. But halfway through the evening, a waiter dropped a tray of champagne glasses near the entrance, and the crash sent Rosalie stumbling backward, her breathing ragged, her hands clawing at her throat. Garrett caught her before she fell. He guided her through a service door into an empty hallway and held her until her pulse stopped racing. She gripped his lapels like he was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. When she finally looked up at him, her eye was wet with tears she refused to let fall. "Don't ask," she whispered. "Please. I can't tell you yet." Garrett nodded. He didn't let go. Colton's nightmares started around the same time. The boy would wake screaming, thrashing against invisible flames, crying for someone to help him. Garrett would rush to his room and hold him until the shaking stopped. but Colton could never remember what he'd been dreaming about. "Just fire," he would mumble. "Fire everywhere. And a lady who carried me out." Garrett assumed it was imagination, the product of a child's mind, processing trauma from the surgery and the strange new living situation. But one night, he found Rosalie already in Colton's room when he arrived. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, stroking the boy's hair, singing something soft and wordless that sounded like grief given melody. When she saw Garrett in the doorway, she stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I heard him crying. I shouldn't have." But Colton's hand was wrapped around her wrist, holding on even in sleep, and Garrett realized his son had never looked more peaceful. The questions started eating at him. How did Rosalie know about his situation? Why had she chosen him specifically? What was behind her mask that terrified her so much? She'd rather buy a husband than show her face. But every time he got close to asking, he remembered the way she looked at his son, with a tenderness that seemed to cause her physical pain, and the words died on his lips. Whatever secret she was keeping, it wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from something far more complicated. Garrett knew about complicated. He knew about carrying guilt so heavy it bent your spine. He'd been carrying his own since the night his wife died, bringing their son into the world. Maybe that was why he stopped pushing. Maybe he recognized a fellow survivor. Month 7 changed everything. Garrett came home from a job site to find Rosalie sitting in the garden, Colton curled up beside her with his head in her lap. The boy was chattering about the fire truck he'd seen that morning, and Rosalie was listening with her hand resting lightly on his hair, her posture soft in a way Garrett had never seen before. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for just a moment, her visible eye crinkled at the corner, almost a smile. Garrett's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He had been telling himself this was an arrangement, a transaction, a temporary inconvenience he'd endure to save his son. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, watching his boy laugh in the lap of a woman whose face he'd never seen, Garrett realized he was in serious trouble. He started finding excuses to be near her. Morning coffee in the kitchen when he knew she'd be there. Evening walks in the garden when the light was soft and forgiving. He told himself he was just being polite, doing his duty as a contractual husband. But the truth sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. He was falling in love with a woman he'd never truly seen. Not her face, not her past, not the truth of who she was. Just the way she moved through the world like she was made of glass, fragile and sharp at the same time. The way she laughed when Colton told terrible jokes, surprised by her own amusement. The way she said Garrett's name, like it was a word she was still learning to pronounce. He caught himself watching her hands when she didn't know he was looking. The way she held a teacup, fingers wrapped around it like she was protecting something precious. The way she turned pages in a book, gentle and reverent, as if words were sacred things. The way she reached toward Colton and then pulled back at the last second, like she was afraid her touch would burn him the way fire had burned her. Garrett wanted to tell her that she could touch his son, that she could touch him. That whatever poison she thought lived in her hands had been burned away long ago, leaving only a woman who loved too much and trusted too little. One evening, Colton fell asleep on the couch between them while they watched an old movie on the television. Rosalie stiffened when the boy's head lolled onto her shoulder, but she didn't move away. Garrett watched her visible eye, the way it softened, the way it filled with something that looked like wonder. She stayed perfectly still for 2 hours, barely breathing, as if Colton was a butterfly that might fly away if she moved too quickly. When the movie ended and Garrett carried the boy to bed, he found Rosalie still sitting in the exact same position, her hand pressed against the spot on her shoulder where Colton's head had rested. She looked at Garrett with her heart in her eye. Raw and unguarded for just a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, for sharing him with me. Garrett didn't know how to tell her that Colton wasn't the only one he wanted to share. Month 9 brought the photograph. Garrett was helping Mrs. Freely move furniture in the West Wing, the only time he'd ever been allowed inside, and a picture frame fell from behind a dresser. He picked it up without thinking, then froze. The image showed a woman standing in front of a burning building, her arms wrapped around a small child she was shielding from the flames. Her face was turned away from the camera, but the child's face was visible. It was Colton. Garrett's hands began to shake. The photograph was dated 3 years ago, before the surgery, before the contract, before any of this made sense. He stared at the image until his vision blurred. Trying to understand how his son could be in a picture with a woman he'd never met. Then he looked closer at the child's pajamas, the blue ones with little rockets that had been Colton's favorite. The same pajamas Garrett had thrown away 3 years ago because they'd been ruined in a fire. The fire. The apartment fire that had broken out in the complex across the street from Garrett's workshop. The one that had spread to the neighboring building where Colton was staying with a babysitter while Garrett finished a late job. The one that had almost killed his son. Garrett had arrived to find firefighters everywhere, and Colton sitting on the curb, wrapped in a blanket, crying for his daddy. The babysitter said someone had pulled the boy out of a second-story window, but no one knew who. By the time the flames were out, the mysterious rescuer had vanished. Garrett had searched for months, desperate to thank whoever had saved his son's life, but he never found them. The hero disappeared like smoke. His legs carried him to Rosalie's office without conscious thought. He pounded on the door until she opened it, her visible eye wide with alarm. Garrett held up the photograph, his hand trembling so violently the frame rattled. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her eye and exhaled, like someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying for years. "I suppose," she said quietly, "it's time you knew the truth." She stepped aside and let him enter, then closed the door behind them and reached for the edge of her mask. The scar started at her left temple and crawled down across her cheek, her jaw, her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her blouse. The skin was mottled and twisted, a map of pain written in flesh. But that wasn't what made Garrett's blood run cold. It was the shape of it, the pattern, a perfect match for the testimony of witnesses who'd described the hero of the apartment fire. A woman who'd climbed through a window, shielded a child with her own body, and taken the full force of a flashover across the left side of her face. Rosalie stood before him with her armor finally removed, her secret finally bare, and waited for his verdict. She told him everything. How she'd been driving past the building that night, saw the flames, heard a child screaming. How she'd climbed a fire escape without thinking, without hesitation, without any concern for her own safety. How she'd found Colton in a smoke-filled bedroom and wrapped herself around him like a cocoon, taking the blast that would have killed him. How she'd passed him to a firefighter on the ladder and then collapsed from shock and pain. How she'd spent 8 months in a burn unit, watching her face disappear under layer after layer of failed skin grafts. How she'd used her family's money to track down the boy she'd saved, to make sure he was healthy, to watch from a distance as he recovered. And how, when she learned he needed surgery that his father couldn't afford, she'd done the only thing she could think of. She'd given him her fortune. She just couldn't bear to give it anonymously. She needed to be close to him, even if he never knew why. The hardest part, she said, her voice breaking, was watching you with him. Seeing what a good father you are, knowing that I could never be part of that. I told myself the contract was enough, that 1 year of being in his life, even from a distance, would be enough. But then he looked at me like I was a person instead of a monster, and you started building things for the house, like this was your home, and I realized I was lying to myself. I didn't want a year. I wanted forever. But how could I ask for that? How could I tell you that I'd been watching your family for 3 years, like some kind of ghost? How could I admit that I engineered our entire marriage because I couldn't bear to live without him anymore? You would have thought I was insane. You would have taken him and run, and I would have deserved it. Garrett listened in silence. When she finished, the room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. 3 years. She had loved his son for 3 years without ever asking for recognition. She had watched him from the shadows, protected him from a distance, sacrificed her face and her anonymity, and finally her freedom just to be near the child she'd saved. And she had never once expected anything in return. Garrett looked at her, at the scar that covered half her face, at the eye that was watching him with naked terror, waiting for him to recoil. He took one step forward, then another. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her damaged cheek in his calloused hand. "You saved my son," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "You saved him, and you never told me. You let me think this was about money, about convenience. You let me think you were some cold, distant stranger buying a husband because she couldn't find one any other way. But you already loved him before I ever knew your name." Rosalie's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her face, trailing over scars and smooth skin alike. "I didn't want gratitude," she whispered. "I wanted him to be safe. I wanted you to be able to take care of him. I never expected. I never meant to." She couldn't finish. Garrett pulled her close and held her while she wept, her hands clutching his shirt, her forehead pressed against his shoulder, her whole body shaking with the release of 3 years of silent devotion. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people finally learning each other's shapes. When Rosalie's sobs faded to hiccups, Garrett pulled back just enough to look at her face, both sides of it, the smooth and the scarred, the hidden and the revealed. He traced the edge of the burn with his thumb, gentle as a prayer. "This isn't ugly," he said softly. "This is the mark of someone who ran into a fire to save a child she didn't know. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Rosalie made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She called him a fool. He agreed. Then he kissed her forehead, right where the scar began, and felt her breath catch like a bird in a cage. The next morning, Garrett sat Colton down and told him a story about a brave princess who climbed a tower of fire to save a little boy. A princess who got hurt very badly, but never stopped watching over the boy from far away. A princess who eventually came to live with the boy and his father because she loved them both more than anything in the world. Colton listened with wide eyes, then looked at Rosalie, who was standing in the doorway with her face uncovered for the first time since he'd known her. The boy walked over to her slowly, reached up, and touched her scar with one small finger. "You're my fire princess," he said. "The one from my dreams. You carried me out." Rosalie dropped to her knees and gathered him into her arms, crying openly now, and Colton held her tight and whispered that it was okay. His daddy fixed broken things, and she wasn't even broken. She was just different. Different was good. The contract expired 2 months later. Peter Callahan arrived with divorce papers, ready to dissolve the marriage as originally agreed. Garrett met him at the door, took the papers, and tore them in half. The lawyer stared at him in disbelief. Garrett simply smiled and said there had been a change of plans. He was keeping his wife, not because of the contract, not because of the money, but because somewhere between the awkward silences and the midnight vigils and the drawings left outside office doors, he had fallen in love with a woman who ran into burning buildings to save strangers' children. A woman who hid behind masks because she thought her scars made her unlovable. A woman who had given him everything and asked for nothing but the chance to exist in his son's orbit. They renewed their vows on a spring afternoon in a garden full of roses that Garrett had spent weeks coaxing back to life. Colton stood between them, holding both their hands, grinning so wide his face looked like it might split. There were no witnesses this time, no lawyers or contracts or conditions. Just a family forged in fire and healed by time, promising to stay together, not because paper said they had to, but because they couldn't imagine any other way. Rosalie stopped wearing the mask after that, not all at once, but slowly in increments. First at home, then in the garden, then at the grocery store, the library, the park where Colton liked to feed the ducks. People stared sometimes. She let them. Garrett would take her hand when he noticed her tensing, and she would squeeze back, drawing strength from his calluses, his steadiness, his unshakable belief that she was beautiful exactly as she was. Colton started calling her Mom 6 months later. It happened at breakfast, casual as breathing. "Pass the syrup, Mom." Rosalie froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Garrett watched her face cycle through shock, disbelief, and finally a joy so pure it hurt to witness. She set down her cup, walked around the table, and hugged the boy so tight he squeaked. "I love you too," she whispered into his hair. "I always have." Colton just grinned and asked if there were more pancakes. Life, it seemed, had taught him not to make a big deal out of miracles. Years later, when people asked how they met, Garrett would smile and say it was complicated. Rosalie would add that she had to save his son from a burning building and marry him under false pretenses before he'd even look at her twice. Colton, now a teenager, would roll his eyes and say his parents were the weirdest people on the planet, but he loved them anyway. And somewhere in a manor that no longer felt haunted, in a garden full of roses that bloomed brighter every year, a family built from ashes and second chances would sit down to dinner together, whole and healed and home. Some people spend their whole lives searching for the kind of love that asks nothing and gives everything. Garrett Hayes found it in a woman who hid her face from the world but showed him her heart. A woman who ran into fire instead of away from it. A woman who proved that the deepest kind of beauty isn't what you see when someone removes their mask. It's what you feel when they trust you enough to try. And on quiet evenings, when the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Garrett would look at his wife's scarred face and his son's bright smile and think that maybe, just maybe, some contracts were never meant to be broken. Some masks were never meant to stay on. And some love stories were written in flame long before the first word was ever spoken. The manor that had once felt like a museum of grief became a home filled with laughter. Garrett repaired every broken shutter, repainted every faded wall, coaxed the garden back from the edge of death until roses bloomed in colors he didn't know existed. Rosalie learned to cook Sunday breakfast, burning more pancakes than she served at first, but improving each week until Colton declared her almost as good as Dad. They hung new photographs on the walls, pictures with faces this time, a family captured in moments of ordinary joy. The faceless portraits were packed away in the attic, relics of a woman who no longer existed. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, Rosalie would wake before dawn and stand alone in the garden, watching the sky lighten. Garrett would find her there, silent and still, and he would stand beside her without speaking. They would watch the sunrise together, the light painting her scars gold and amber and rose, and she would lean into him like he was the only solid ground in a world that had once tried to burn her alive. It was their ritual, their remembrance, their way of honoring the night that had destroyed one life and created another. And when people asked Garrett how he'd found such happiness after losing his first wife, after nearly losing his son, after all the darkness that had tried to swallow him whole, He would smile and look at the woman beside him, the woman who had walked through fire to save a stranger's child, and then spent 3 years loving that child from the shadows. He would take her scarred hand in his calloused one and say that sometimes the greatest blessings come wrapped in the strangest packages. Sometimes the person you need most is the one you never thought to look for. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love finds you in the ashes and teaches you how to bloom again.